All right, Amanda, you're good to go.
All right. Welcome to the eSolutions Exchange webinar, Maximize Your ROI on EPA, How Leading Plans Are Addressing 5 Key Questions. I'm Amanda Abbott. I am Vice Chair of the eSolutions Exchange Steering Committee. I am also manager of our EDI Operations and Systems Support Department at Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Kansas, which is one of our 2025 conferences that is co-hosting this year's conference. eSolutions Exchange provides a forum for the exchange of questions and answers about all aspects of EDI. Its objective is to bring people together to share knowledge, lessons learned, and successes. We hope you'll make plans to join us at our 2025 annual conference that will be held August 24th through the 27th, 2025 in Kansas City, Missouri. This conference is proudly hosted by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Kansas and Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Kansas City. Our tentative conference agenda and registration are now available on our website at esolutionsexchange.org. A few housekeeping items just to address with you. We will be addressing all questions at the end of the webinar, so please use the question function on the dashboard at any time during the presentation to type and submit your questions to our speakers. If they are able to see them throughout and it makes sense to respond to them, they will, but we will get to the questions at the end as well. A little bit about our speakers. Stephen Berkow is Senior Advisor, Value-Based Care with InterSystems. Stephen leads efforts across InterSystems to ensure our technology and wraparound services support plans, providers, and other healthcare organizations in advancing value-based care. InterSystems is a global leader in connecting data sources to increase care continuity, close care gaps, streamline operations, and address data-related regulatory mandates. Stephen brings to his work at InterSystems a passion for making healthcare better and over 2 decades of experience as an executive and GM for both provider and plan organizations. Prior to joining InterSystems, he launched SaaS-based businesses at Optum Insight, managed the advisory board's best practice memberships for health system executives, and oversaw Press Ganey's solution for improving clinician engagement and workforce productivity. Also with us is Jessica Jowdy. She is the Manager of Healthcare Sales Engineering at InterSystems. Jess is a seasoned healthcare sales engineering leader specializing in advanced interoperability solutions that improve the efficiency and effectiveness of clinical and operational systems within the country's largest and most complex healthcare organizations. In her 9th year at InterSystems, she's passionate about bridging technical and business requirements and works to design scalable interoperability frameworks that align with industry standards and market needs. Jessica leads cross-functional teams to deliver end-to-end solutions that support compliance with regulatory demands while also promoting innovation within organizations. Jess thrives on solving real-world challenges in healthcare and empowering organizations to achieve their digital transformation goals. At this time, I'll turn it over to Stephen and Jessica. Thank you so much for being here.
Good morning. I think it's morning. I got to get the time zones right. I know this is national. I just want to start off by thanking everybody for carving out an hour from what I know must be a hectic day. And what we hope to accomplish across the hour, kind of to translate this title into plain English, is we really want to talk through with you what are the key things you need to be thinking about now to best position your plan to maximize the ROI on effectively what's been mandated to automate prior authorization by the CMS Rule 057. As you can imagine, based on that long-winded description of me, I spent a lot of time talking with health plan executives around the country around this very question. So I really appreciate the opportunity provided by eSolutions to kind of share this information broadly. Hopefully it's good information everybody can take advantage of. And Jess, in addition to kind of being a manager of all of our sales engineers, she actually rolls up her sleeves and is working pretty closely with a number of the larger payers in terms of how to leverage our technology to architect solutions. So hopefully she will ground me as we go through the next hour. I do have one slide on InterSystems. So here we go. Let's see if I can get it. So this is just a sampling of all the customers we're serving across North America. We are a global company. And I share this for two reasons. One, just to acknowledge our bias. If you look in the center of the screen, you'll see that a major pillar of our customer base is health plans, a number of blues, nationals, a number of leading provider-sponsored plans. And as you can imagine, because we are serving a number of plans, we do have a full suite of technologies and services, not just to support compliance with EPA, but also the access provisions of 057. So I just want to acknowledge right off the bat that, yes, we do have kind of a horse in this race. But the second reason why I share this is you can also note that while we bring that bias, we don't bring a bias of any one kind of segment within healthcare. We are really serving the full suite of the industry. And I think that's really important when it comes to kind of maximizing your ROI on an EPA solution, because in contrast to the other kind of access API provisions within 0057, this, EPA is really going to have to be exchanged. It's an ongoing dialogue among the key stakeholders. So at least we're finding it really, really helpful that we're working with everyone. If you go up top, you can see that we're the technology underneath Epic's EHR. To the far left, our technology is in place to integrate disparate data streams at most providers. And we're also working with 6 and a growing number of HIEs, I think, which is also important because we're going to get into it, but they're one of the kind of leading theories of the case in terms of how to intermediate the dialogue between the providers and the health plans. All right, just 2 more wind-up slides before we really get into it. Before we go forward, I just want to take a quick step back. More clearly, or more specifically, I want to just take a quick step back to the beginning of 2004. And on the left, a reminder of where we all were. Just a profusion of health cares, not just in the trade press, but in the popular press, really talking about the general frustration with prior authorization and putting plans on the defensive. I love the slide on the right. I challenge anyone to hazard a guess in terms of what this is, but it's buried in there. This is actually the cover page for 0057. You can see it in there, advancing interoperability and proving prior authorization processes. And so I think it's really interesting where kind of the government goes with all of this. There's no kind of monolithic rule or reg that comes out that directly takes on kind of all the frustration that's being expressed to the national press. Instead, what happens is the government puts down their chips in a pretty big way on interoperability. And it's really, I think in many ways, wonderful how they did it. It is not kind of just random mandates. Basically, what they are really trying to kickstart here with this rule, if you read all 1,000 pages, is doing enough regulation to get the necessary parties to put the interoperability stakes in the ground, not just to address the frustrations on the left, but to advance kind of value-based care more broadly. And it's really interesting in my travels and Jess's travels, as we talk to people about, on the turning from the negative to the positive, what do they hope to accomplish by electronic prior authorization, or EPA? I'll say that a lot. This is my own personal word cloud of what I've heard as I go around the country. And just note the kind of note on your bottom left. It is not scientific, but I think it is a great start point for this conversation, because what we're trying to get at today is there are certain things that health plans must do to comply with 0057. But the way that this rule is written, it is an invitation, literally, to make the necessary investments to get far greater returns. And that's really what we want to focus on today. We want to think about what are the decisions we want to pull forward to ensure that the investments that we make today, I'm not saying that they should cost more. We just want to ensure that they are not just getting us compliance, but they are moving us toward kind of the returns that are possible that you see on the screen. Whether you're trying to get there really, really quickly, or you happen to be at a plan that has a lot of technical debt or other priorities, and it's going to take a little bit longer. Nonetheless, we want to be sure that the right Lego pieces are put in the ground so that you can build upon them, and you're going to get this either in the near term or the longer term. All right, here's our game plan for the rest of our time. Jess and I want to take about 10 to 15 minutes to just kind of distill that 1,000-page regulation down to just one slide, just to call out what are some of the key requirements and recommendations that I think are critical to kind of understanding how to consider these 5 key questions. Then we want to dedicate about 20 minutes to going through these 5 questions. And then lastly, whatever time we have left, we want to open it up for Q&A. So Jess, I don't see the Q&A in my presentation mode. I don't know if you see it.
I can see the chat. I'm not sure if I can see the Q&A. Oh, I do see the Q&A. I lied. I can see the Q&A. So I'll be monitoring that as well if there are questions that come up from the group.
Yeah, so please don't sit on your hands. If you have questions in the moment, I got about 60% of the speaking load, so I think Jess will try to handle maybe some Q&A in the moment, or call it out if it's highly relevant to the point we're talking about. Okay, so my next slide literally is my best effort to distill that 1,000-page rule into one slide. And I'm not going to go through it line by line, but there are 7 things, literally 7 things I want to be sure that people take away from this slide. The first is actually the subtitle, Requirements and Recommendations. And I think it's really important for people to understand that there are many things in the rule that are articulated as requirements, but there are many things that the rule recommends. And let me be clear, I am in no way suggesting you want to make this, clarification because you shouldn't go do the recommendations. We are largely proponents of everything that's being recommended. But if we're trying to maximize ROI, it is important to kind of know this differentiation, because if it's recommended, it gives you kind of more leeway to kind of meet that, I don't want to say requirement, but provision at the time that it makes most sense for your strategy. So you have, for lack of a better word, more wiggle room in terms of when you want to stage it on your timeline. Now, I'm assuming many on the line, your eyes are already migrating to the right. So the technology provisions, the APIs that must be stood up and fully functional by Jan 1, 2027. And that makes sense because they're pretty complex, and you definitely want to be starting now to hit that deadline for when they need to go effective. However, I want to pull you back to the left for at least a minute, because there is a near deadline, the very outset of next year, and at least top line very quickly, the timeliness and transparency provisions, which are going into effect a year sooner. Again, not going to do everything, just a couple of things I want to call out. So as you start to scan down the left column, you're going to, bump into this language, impacted payers. And instead of articulating who is an impacted payer, sometimes I think it's faster just to articulate who's not. So impacted payers, payers who are subject to this rule. Who's not included there, the two big exceptions are traditional Medicare and commercial plans or commercial products. I do think everybody on the line should realize, though, it's becoming pretty clear that if you're trying to maximize ROI, you want to be sure that what you're envisioning works for all of your product types for a couple of reasons. First, there's a growing number of states who are already expanding 0057 to all payer types. And, what we're learning from kind of people who monitor this stuff is it's likely to continue to expand. And also there's, a slew of business reasons. I mean, this goes back to that word cloud. All products can benefit from automating prior authorization. And we're seeing, I don't know if we have somebody from the association on the line, but we're seeing various associations and other business groups actually call on their members to ensure that, how they're building this out doesn't just work for impacted product types, but all product types. So I think that's one thing you want to keep top of mind. Kind of the next thing I want to call out is the response timeframe. So by January 1, 2026, plans or impacted plans, but really plans are obligated to respond to prior auth submissions within 72 hours of getting all the documentation they need for expedited requests and 7 calendar days for standard requests. And, for the IO people on the line, you might want to talk to your utilization management people because they will probably bring your blood pressure down. So at least with the plans I've been working with, these goals often predate the regulation. And in fact, these goals were already the goals a number of the plans that I'm working with were already shooting towards, or put another way, the current kind of back office systems, many of them were already shooting towards these goals. So again, it is an opportunity for us to be very, very strategic about how we go forward, because this is evolution, not transformation here in terms of the time. And also, if you go down to the next kind of bullet right below it, it's not like there's any mechanism for auto approval if you happen to exceed the deadline on a submission. There's really no enforcement mechanisms beyond what's at the bottom, which is public reporting. And I've just circled one thing here to underscore the public reporting provisions. The clock is already ticking. And I don't mean towards the effectiveness date, but what you're going to have to report on in 2026 is your performance in 2025. So although kind of the standards in the response timeframes are worthy goals, but I think if you talk to your people, you're going to learn they're not that overwhelming. You are going to have to publicly report on what's happening right now. So there is some urgency here to be sure that we're moving forward with automating prior authorization. All right, let's switch over to the other side and the technology provisions where these mandates are 1/1/2027. The thing I want to call, and if you're keeping up with me, I'm up to 6, only 2 more to go. 6 things I want to call out, 7 things I want to call out in total. I think when we get to the APIs, it's really important when you're talking with people that this is one place where you want to differentiate between what is required and what is recommended. What is required is those big 3s, that the APIs that plans must support must be able to identify whether an item or service requires prior authorization, identify the specific documentation requirements for approval, and facilitate electronically the exchange or the consideration and response to the PA requests. That's what the actual rule requires. And then what the rule does is it strongly recommends adoption of the 3 Da Vinci IGs or implementation guides on burden reduction in terms of how to meet those 3 mandates. And for those who aren't familiar, The Da Vinci Group is a collaborative group across payers, providers, vendors. We're very involved in it. We're, again, biased. We're very, very big proponents of it. It is the kind of the collaborative standard our industry is working towards in terms of how to do these three things. But again, it is strongly recommended, so it gives us some leeway. Plans, it gives you some leeway in terms of how to comply with or how to effectuate these implementation guides on a timeline and a staging that works for you. And this is important for that fact. It's also important that some of these guides are still evolving. So it gives us the leeway. You can decide whether you want to be a first mover or a second mover in terms of the provisions that are still evolving. The last thing I want to call out is down at the bottom. So far, everything we've talked about pertains to payers or health plans. There is a provision in there requiring participating providers to report a yes response in effect, to a test. Yes, I utilized ePA this last year. Initially, there was a proposal that they had to provide more detail on how many times, but at least for now, CMS said, no, we just want to say, yes, I tried it. And this is really important because ultimately, if we're going to get ROI, obviously we need our network providers to use what we are building. And at least right now, I think it's important to remember that we are going to need them to want to walk this path because the parallel set of requirements for providers is just saying, give it a try. And when they give it a try, we have to be sure they like it. So they come back and, for lack of a better word, tell their friends. I'm going to turn it over to Jess to delve a little bit deeper on the IGs and how they see the workflows going.
Thanks, Stephen. So as Stephen mentioned, when we talk about those highly recommended implementation guides that surround the electronic prior authorization process, you'll see these three acronyms pop up all the time. CRD, DTR, PASS. For those who don't know what they stand for, I think you get bonus points if you do know what those acronyms stand for, but that's coverage requirements, discovery, documentation, template, and rules, and then prior authorization support. And so those three requirements for APIs that Stephen mentioned, determining whether or not a prior authorization is required, providing that supporting documentation, and then ultimately being able to submit a prior authorization request. These API or these IGs kind of govern those three actions. So we'll kind of go into each of those different workflows, but think of CRD as, do I need a prior auth? And what documentation would be required to support that? DTR is very much around fetching that documentation and being able to supply that to providers so that they can fill that out. And then the prior authorization support is that submission of the prior authorization request, as well as the communication of the outcome. So doing things like supporting subscriptions or notifications to providers as status changes for a particular prior auth request. Oh, that's perfect. Thanks, Stephen. We almost timed that perfectly. So with the CRD workflow, CRD is once again about determining whether or not a prior auth is required. It leverages a CDS hooks functionality. So those who are familiar with more of the FHIR standard coming from the technical perspective, we'll talk about a couple of benefits in using CDS hooks in the next slide. But essentially in the thought process is within a provider's kind of native workflow. The idea is, on order sign, on appointment book, there's a set of triggers that are defined by the CDS hook standard. But in these different triggering events, the CRD process is instigated, where a request goes out to the health plan based on that particular event to determine whether or not a prior authorization is required. Eligibility is checked, clinical rules are evaluated. There might be additional back and forth for missing information, but ultimately what gets determined or what gets sent back is whether or not that prior authorization is what is required or not, or maybe it's auto approved. And if the prior authorization is required, that kind of brings you into the next IG or the next API, which is the DTR process, which we'll get to in a second. So I mentioned that CRD, it's based on CDS hooks, and there's some unique benefits in using CDS hooks. And if Stephen goes to the next slide, one of the things that CDS hooks uses is this card mentality. So there's these different triggering events that are built to be kind of native to the provider's EMR workflow. And when these requests and responses come back, the responses are in the form of a card. The card will communicate things like whether or not a prior auth is required. But one of the other things it can do is supply additional information back to the provider based on, for instance, the service that's being requested. So you could also incorporate things like clinical suggestions, surface up duplicates, other kinds of content that you want to get in front of the provider as they're making this particular action. So it's a way to kind of expand out the usage of CRD to incorporate kind of other value adds and get more kind of visibility or more information in front of the provider besides just kind of like a Boolean, if you will, of whether or not a prior auth is required. So we see a lot of value that comes from this kind of CDS hook side of the house because we have this card mentality on how we can kind of share information. So in the event that through the CRD process, for instance, we determine that a prior authorization is required, the CRD will communicate back a series of questionnaires or documentation that are then brought into the DTR process. So in the DTR process, we then go and we fetch that documentation. So in this slide, we're kind of going from DTR down. So with CRD, we've acquired essentially like pointers or links to where that documentation resides. DTR will fetch that information. Some of the things just to think about with DTR, the documentation in the IG, for instance, there's references to FHIR-based questionnaires. One of the value adds with FHIR-based questionnaires is embedding things like CQL statements into FHIR-based questionnaires. What that essentially allows is for you to send over questionnaires that can be pre-populated with information that may reside in the provider system. So it's a way to kind of further reduce the burden of providing kind of the medical information required to support a prior authorization request by automating that fetching process. So incorporating CQL into these questionnaires is incredibly beneficial if you can do that. In this kind of DTR process, there's a few different kind of paradigms to work through, or that a provider can work through, but we'll take kind of the simple example of them staying within their kind of EHR workflow. They have a rendering of this questionnaire within the EHR workflow. They're completing it. They might be saving it every once in a while. Usually those questionnaires or that documentation isn't getting completed in one sitting. But when they're making those edits and those modifications, they're actually storing that information locally within their EMR and then bringing it back up kind of like as a draft as they complete that documentation. There's also concepts with DTR of like adaptive questionnaires, which essentially means that what question comes next is dependent on the responses of the previous questions. So it's a way to kind of, give kind of tailored questionnaires or responses based on the content that's coming back. But following this DTR process, we have this documentation. It's local to the EMR. We then execute our PAS call, or prior authorization support API call. In this situation, we're kind of packaging up that documentation into a FHIR request that gets once again sent over to the plan system. Here, there might be some back and forth in the sense that more information may be required. A determination may not be able to be given immediately, in which case there is kind of like this subscription or this polling process that could happen depending on whether you're doing a push versus pull model for notifying providers. But essentially, as that prior auth changes its status, individuals, providers can be notified of those changes in prior authorization status. So the pass submission is really both the submission of the prior authorization as well as the kind of notifications that come after it. There's also some conversations on FHIR in X12 and FHIR in X12, which Stephen, I think, had on his prior slide or one of his prior slides. And so this PAS workflow can incorporate both FHIR-based X12 based and hybrid approaches as well. And there's a lot of kind of intricacies in how this works. I think we'll get into with the 5 questions that we ask ourselves with the ePA. This kind of provider system on the left, plan system on the right, and these arrows kind of just going unidirectional is a very simplified version of how this process actually works. I like to think of it as a dance. If you've talked to me before, I talk about it as a dance where there's a lot of orchestration, a lot of back and forth, a lot of routing that happens. And so this process actually can leverage kind of orchestrators, and not to kind of steal Stephen's thunder as we get a little bit further along in the presentation, but that's kind of where having things like brokers or orchestrators can help, handle those complexities that come with the prior auth process. So then the last thing I'll say as we complete our overview of kind of the high level EPA requirements is we do have a published white paper on kind of things to consider. Stephen was the main contributor, main author of this. It is a very, it distills down the regulation pretty nicely. It summarizes things pretty clearly. We highly recommend that you download it, take a look at it, read it over. And we want to share as much knowledge as we can about the regulation as possible to the community. So with that, I think I'll pass back to Stephen. We'll talk a little bit more about these 5 questions that we consider when talking about EPA.
Thanks, Jess. There's also a link there for people who are curious about kind of going deeper in terms of how kind of our solutions kind of do this. There's a link to, we call it FHIR Services. That's the suite of solutions if you go online. I just did want to kind of go back here for 1 second and just remind people of why it's so important to differentiate between what's required and what's recommended. Because as we're building this out, right now, Jess referenced adaptive forms. To be honest, there is some differentiation right now in terms with regard to the EHRs, in terms of some of them wanting to pull this forward and some of them pushing them back in terms of the timeline, in terms of what they will support. Same thing with regard to CQL. It is unclear in terms of, even if on the plan side, we build in the capability to send out CQL questionnaires that will be automatically populated, depending upon what environment it's going into. What you will be able to get back will differ based on differing timelines. So, these are all things we want to do it all. That's not the question. It's how do we stage the effort to maximize our ROI? All right, with that, let's get into the 5 questions. Again, I want to underscore that these are strategy questions. If you asked us to, articulate what are the technical questions that should be, you should be asking up front, it would be a much longer list. Of course, if that's something you want to talk through, please reach out to us. We're happy to walk through kind of like when we go through and come in, what are the technical questions we want to walk through somebody with to understand where they're at, to ensure we can optimize where they're going to go. These questions, Jess and I just sat down and we're like, okay, when you're thinking this through, what are the bigger questions that we're getting that we think it's really important that plan leaders pull up front to ensure that as they're architecting this out, they're not just thinking compliance, but they're making the right decisions in the moment that are going to maximize the ROI of this investment, both in the near term, the middle term, and the long term. All right, question number 1. This is what systems are in scope for your EPA deployment and what's needed for them to communicate electronically. All right, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, the first thing I want to do is just step back and kind of share what's the general blueprint that all key stakeholders are thinking about in terms of how this exchange is going to be automated. And in the middle of the screen, what's kind of within those 2 dotted red lines, that is what is mandated by the rule. That is what is required by the rule and the associated 3 IGs that Jess went through, so that you have to have the APIs and they have to be able to answer those 3 questions. And so it's really important to think beyond that if we're going to maximize the return on the investment within the 2 red dots. So I'm going to start really quickly on the left on the provider side. Providers have spoken pretty loud and long that they want this workflow to kickstart from within the EHR. It is one area there where they've been really, really consistent. And there was another rule called HTI2, which proposed that, in effect, EHRs would be obligated to build and maintain a parallel set of APIs, FHIR-based APIs, which would mirror the plan side APIs. So a piece of HTI2 was finalized. It does not include this. So just remember what an API is. It's not a GUI. It's just exposing the endpoints. So one of the things we still need to sort through is who is going to intermediate, in effect, that dance, if you will, Jess, between the plan-supported APIs and the provider EHRs. I was actually on a phone call the other day with the CIO of health at CMS, and by no means are they abandoning those provisions of HTI2. They're still thinking about them, but there is no clear timeline in terms of the path forward, which is again why we think it's really important that we continue to work with the EHRs, the HIEs, the larger systems, because all the leading theories in terms of how to make that connection, it revolves around those 3 groups. If you shift over to the other side, this is really where I think everybody on the line really has a huge opportunity to maximize ROI. So let's think about the systems. There's really 2 big systems or groups of systems that you're going to have to tap into to streamline prior authorization. The first are running across the top. They're to answer, if you're going to answer as a PA required, you're first going to have to confirm the member is eligible. Then you're going to have to determine, what plan is this member participating in, and what is specifically covered under that plan. And even if you get a yes to prior authorization, when you look at that, that might flip to a no when you look at the provider status because of the growing number of network providers who we are gold carding. So that's one set of systems that you have to be thinking about. The other set of systems is kind of running down the vertical. These are what many people call the systems, so the clinical rules and the utilization review. Once we're going to have to kind of reach in to those systems to get that answer back in terms of what documentation is required, and then ultimately to adjudicate and get the answer. We also put the longitudinal health record here. If you don't have one, it's something you want to build towards for many reasons, but specifically here, because that information that we're getting through CDEX or CQL, we want to be sure it goes somewhere, because hopefully going forward, what we have to go all the way back to the provider to get to adjudicate prior auth requests will lessen as increasingly we've already got that information before and we can repurpose it. Not just on the adjudication, but big vision actually all the way up front in terms of contracted coverage. You might or might not need prior auth because other things we now know about our member because we have it stored in our longitudinal health record. All right, I'm going to hand it back to Jess to go a little bit deeper on what the needed architecture of this kind of middleware to connect into all these back office systems might look like. Big picture, you've got to be thinking about what's my API router? Do I have a smart router to get me to the right backend system? And often, do I have an integration engine? Because many of the plans we work with, these back office systems don't speak FHIR.
Yep. Thanks, Stephen. So if you imagine your left side panel, that's going to be your provider systems. Your far right side is going to be kind of the ecosystem of health plan applications and systems that are part of this orchestration process. And if we start with just, basic concepts of whether or not a prior auth is being handled internally by a health plan or being outsourced, that in and of itself is a routing concept, right? If I get this particular request coming in for a service, maybe it's durable medical equipment or something like that, and that actually needs to be outsourced to, a third party vendor, then there needs to be some kind of evaluation that this is the service or the instrument or the element that's being requested, and bring that over appropriately. So from a routing perspective, we've looked at this from the types of services being requested. For those that have expanded to all lines of business, different applications or different kind of installations or instances of applications may vary based on lines of business. The other kind of piece to consider too is, for a lot of these applications that we're connecting to start with the fact that these FHIR IGs aren't, very old, and they're continuing to develop. A lot of these applications we're connecting to have been around for a while. And being able to, we call it play the data where it lies, or be able to work with those systems in the way that they like to communicate is really important for being able to not only get these kinds of interactions or workflows up and running quickly, but also to be able to preserve that interaction longer term. And so, for instance, from the provider side, we can expect FHIR, right? Because we're dealing with FHIR-based interactions. A lot of these provider EMRs are standardizing on those FHIR-based interactions to support the EPA process. But that doesn't necessarily mean that your eligibility systems or your medical policies, or if you're calling out and getting kind of advanced decision support that you're integrating into these processes, it doesn't necessarily mean that those also speak FHIR. And so being able to coordinate or transform or map that information into a model or a format that those applications can understand, being able to receive those responses and maybe having to take subsequent actions before sending a response back to the provider. All that stuff needs to be happening in some kind of broker or middleware solution that speaks those IGs from one side, right, on this left side of the screen, but on the right side can be flexible enough to integrate with all of these different permutations of technology that you have kind of behind your four walls, as well as that ecosystem of vendors or other partners that you might have. So from our perspective, in a happy path example, it would be great to be able to just kind of have a direct correlation, but in the real world, there's a lot of permutations or complexities with how EPAs are handled, and how these CRD, DTR, and PASS requests need to be routed and transformed and manipulated. And so we really see having that kind of interoperability layer or a broker layer sitting in the middle to be critical in order for, for this kind of technology to be able to succeed.
Okay. Question 3. We got to pick it up here. Can your current system store retrieved clinical data in a longitudinal?
I think we're on question 2, Stephen. If you want to.
Oh my gosh, we got to really speed it up. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, are there best practices for translating medical policies into machine-readable language? Thanks, Jess. I kind of put back up a slide that Jess already showed. I want to focus on the far right, and I want to kind of keep riffing on those systems that Jess was referencing, specifically your systems that hold your medical rules. I've got 3 here. Every plan that we go into, they don't have one set of rules. They have a set of proprietary rules. They have license rules from Interqual or somebody else. And then there's often, as just noted, some delegated vendors. So it might be around behavioral health. It might be around imaging, kind of narrow areas where you might be saying, you know what, in effect, we're going to outsource prior authorization adjudication to a specialty vendor who is, deep in this one area. As a matter of fact, most of the plans we go into have 4 or 5, 6 different systems. They might be using multiple different sets of licensed rules. And so it does beg this question, are there best practices for translating medical policies into machine readable language? Because unfortunately, Many of these policies, it's not just that they're not in machine readable language. The way they were written, it wasn't even with the idea in mind that ultimately we would want machines to be able to read and apply these rules. So the actual rules themselves have to be restructured, which is absolutely right answer and is absolutely a lot of work. So again, going back to that ROI stuff, if, step one is I got to translate all my rules into machine readable language, it really kind of stops progress. And the good news here is, again, there are no requirements about doing this. It is right answer, and we want to get there. And best practice is becoming very, very clear. Every plan that we're working with is reaffirming that there are big 80/20s here. In other words, there is a relatively small set of medical rules that are fueling a large set of prior auth requests in the right place in terms of where do you want to put your effort into making something machine readable is in those rules. And as a matter of fact, we have some plans who are kind of doing that 2 by 2 and then doing it again. They're looking at those rules and saying, let's start with the path of least resistance. When we look at that subset of rules, which are the ones that are closest or easiest to turn into machine readable language, and that let's do that. It helps speed up for kind of the bigger piece of the puzzle, adjudication of prior auth, and simultaneously it frees up your medical directors to focus on a smaller subset of rules where kind of their human touch is really essential. Okay. Now, question 3. Can your current system store retrieved clinical data in a longitudinal health record that powers multiple use cases? All right, so why are we harping on the longitudinal health record? For the people on the line, you might want to kind of talk with your IO people, and one of the things you'll learn is that we're not yet in an environment where kind of the provider side is just, kind of freely sharing clinical records. That obviously this is information that the government plans hope that we can increasingly build because it is so critical to advancing the use cases that I've kind of noted up top, all the things we want to do to leverage data to advance value-based care. And so why we're harping on the longitudinal health record is in 0057, the prior auth APIs is one of the 2 APIs that isn't just about pushing information out to other parties. It's also about you, the plan, getting information. And here, specifically getting information from the provider. So we want to be sure that we're thinking about where can we put this information and get it normalized so that we can use it to fuel other use cases. And I know Jess has done kind of more thinking on this than I have. And she has kind of when you start to think, what is an LHR? I'm going to give this to you and let Jess talk a little bit about, what should be kind of in effect in your RFI in terms of the specs you should be looking for to get the LHR you need.
Yep. And so at a high level, we know that the regulation does in some cases, and I know we're not talking about the other APIs, but like with payer to payer require that you bring in information, right, from other sources and kind of harmonize that with the information that you know about your members to create a longitudinal record. CDEX also kind of brings in this concept. So when we talk about so when we talk about creating an LHR, the idea is at one point rooted in being able to harmonize the information coming from all these different kind of APIs or sources. But it's not so much just an aggregation of that information, right? Because information might be coming through different formats or protocols. They might have different standards they're working with. We always say when you've seen one, for instance, HL7 message or one CCD document, you've seen one CCD document. Even with FHIR, there's extensions and things that might be slightly different between sources. So, when we're kind of creating a scorecard for an LHR, The big, and I can spend a lot of time talking about this slide, but the big thing we try to harp on is it's a map once, use many paradigm. So the idea is, create strategies or work with technology that allows you to quickly and efficiently kind of map that information into a common model that can be exposed in a lot of different ways to support a lot of different use cases or scenarios. At a minimum, to support those FHIR-based APIs for regulatory purposes. But the value that comes from being able to bring in information from other sources is to drive things like gap in care closure, care continuity, or HEDIS score. There's so many different things that you can do by bringing all that information together. And so being sure, or coming up with efficient strategies for loading it, for mapping it into a common model, but then being able to kind of reuse that for other purposes is critical for an LHR. And I'll leave it at that. Maybe I can put like a teaser for a longer session on something like that. But we see a lot of importance in that.
All right, question 4. What steps in your prior authorization process account for the dominant share of provider abrasion, and how can you best leverage your investment in ePA to streamline provider workflows for these touch points? Why is this question so important? We talked about it before. Just remember the box at the bottom, because at the end of the day, at least right now, what providers are required to do is, in effect, try it to attest that they've used it. There's no volume that they have to use it right now to kind of meet their obligations. And so what you see on the slide is just kind of the 4 points of value that we talk about with a lot of providers on their side. And there's some really good news here. What we're hearing and seeing in those conversations is that even if plans could quickly get to just that first one, just a faster clarification of whether PA is required, that would be very, very meaningful to them. And I will tell you that the numbers we're seeing in pilots in terms of, it's almost, you could be awestruck, 50, 60% of prior auths that are submitted, the answer is, it doesn't even need to be required. And when I've talked with plans about why do you think that's so high, providers, so many of them have said, well, because we're actually required to submit, even if we don't think a PA is required, because we want the documentation, which actually makes it even more valuable that this is fast. And also, I met with 2 provider roundtables last week, and we were talking about where's the value. And they even set the bar lower on this first prong than I think plans are. I think on the plan side, there's so many people aspiring for that real-time interchange and this vision that the clinician at the point of care could answer the patient directly, and it could influence kind of the care map they draw out for them. Providers actually telling me, you know what, the first thing we're going to do is not move prior auth into the patient room. It's probably going to remain a back office function, but just that ability to speed up and get that answer quickly for kind of our back office staff who are doing this, they see huge efficiencies and benefits for their patients. So I think we can do this. There's huge opportunities to actually front load enough that providers are going to want to utilize this if it works well. Last question. What groups or team members in your organization will own implementation and rollout of your APIs? And do you have cross-functional work groups and or meetings in place to optimize their collaboration? Now, I'm guessing, some people on the line are wondering, why the heck did you include that question? Of course, we're talking about EPA all the time. So I just want to kind of just share some of my injustice experience, and to be honest, some of kind of people who hold my role at other vendors, they're seeing the same things. I will tell, when we go into work with you, we often ask questions, or we always ask questions. If we're talking with the people, what are the systems you have in place? Because our goal is, we recognize that we're not, building on a blank slate. You have technologies in place, and we want to optimize them to the extent we can. Vice versa, when we go in and our start point is the IO people, we say, well, how do these processes currently work? Because we want to actually not, again, we want to build off what you already have in place. And the most common answer we get, right, Jess, is that's a really good question. I'm going to have to call somebody to find out. And, you know, it is really, really important, not just that you're talking with each other, that you have forums where these things can come up. I think we're at the point right now where we really think best practice is to actually have forums and committees that are cross-functional, that are wholly dedicated for the short term in terms of how are we going to architect our EPA solution. I'm going to stop there because I do have a few questions that have come in. If people have more questions, please go ahead and type them in. The first question, Jess, I have is for you. What's the difference between an LHR and or a data lake and or a FHIR repository?
Yeah. And I see we have probably like 4 or 5 questions, so I'll try to go fast on this because I know we have a lot in the chat too that we're going off of. But you know, it really they're just different ways of making data actionable, right? So so with a FHIR repository, you're kind of committed to a particular format that does interoperability based exchanges. That's kind of what we're pretty focused on. When you get into more of an LHR, the idea with the LHR, as I kind of mentioned, is around kind of formatting information to make it reusable and actionable and creating strategies to be able to harmonize that data across those sources.
All right, so I have a question here. Could you please confirm the date for reporting? So I had a couple of questions about this. So what I was alluding to is, in effect, the information we report in 2026 is our performance in 2025. The other question is, wait, aren't there some things that you report on 2026? Honestly, I'm going to have to double check the rule, but it is a good question because my guess is, even though the reporting requirements take effect on Jan 1, 2026, if this reads like other rules, my assumption is you're not going to be obligated to report everything on that first date, that there's provisions in there in terms of when kind of in the ensuing months you actually have to file your reports. And by the way, we're still waiting for the government in terms of how these reports should be formatted. So we're still looking for that. Jess, I don't know if you've picked other questions. I'm trying to.
Yep. I see one question around, my understanding is that CDEX supporting documentation may be sent in with pass or after if documentation is missing. You know, compares request via task for information to complete a prior auth approval. Absolutely. So CDEX is not a formal requirement for the regulation, but there's a ton of value that we see CDEX having. And within our own solutions, we are including CDEX as a module because we see the value it can bring in both the EPA process for being able to acquire that documentation, but also kind of beyond for other, you know, use cases that might come up beyond the EPA process. So absolutely, I think CDEX has a lot of value and potential. I think the big question mark is around the readiness on the provider side to accept CDEX requests, and that's going to depend on the providers that we're working with.
So next question, we'll just do a couple more, and then we'll try to reach out to people individually that we missed. How far along are payers and providers today with the DTR work? So I think the actual question is not providers, but it's provider EHRs. Because that response to the DTR, if we're going to do this through CQL, which is really the desire, that's going to be something that the EHRs have to support. On the payer side, it's highly variable. And I just really encourage you, when you're architecting your solution, that you really press us or another vendor in terms of, number one, how are you testing this? We're doing tons of testing. And 2, how can you ensure that you're building this to scale? I'll tell you our experience. It's really, really important that your solution scales. Goes back to what we talked about before. If not immediately, ultimately, you're going to want to do this for all your products, not just your impacted products. I'm going to do just one more.
Stephen, yeah, we're at the top of the hour now, so I know people are going to be dropping, but I wanted to thank both you and Jessica for today's webinar presentation, and our Blues member who took time out of their day to join this first 2025 eSolutions Exchange webinar. And we hope to see all of you at the 2025 annual conference that will be held August 24th through 27th in Kansas City, Missouri. So thank you all again and have a great day.
Thank you for giving us the hour. Goodbye.
You bet. Thank you so much. Good information.